Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show, the show that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping the world and inspiring future creators, and for everyone that likes really big ideas and stories. I'm Ira Pastor. I'm your health, aging, and longevity ambassador along for this ride. For the last several shows, we've been spending time at different levels, talking about health, disease, and aging. And primarily focused on the small stuff. We've been talking about genes and proteins and cells, tissues and organs, things of this nature, as well as a little bit about sort of the internal microenvironment of the body. We've talked about the microbiome, the macrobiome. But today, one area that we have not touched on yet is what we sort of referred to as sort of the Cosmo-biologic dynamics that affect our health and wellness. And when we say Cosmo-biologic, we're referring to the increasing amount of evidence in the scientific literature about how big things, the sort of major cosmic level factors affect all parts of our health and our biology. Things on this list can include the Earth's electromagnetic field, solar and lunar cycles, sound, gravity. One only needs to look at that recent experiment done with the space station and the twins that one went up to the space station and one stayed on Earth, and they're very different effects. Even time and the evolving area of chronobiology. But one component of this, which has gotten extremely popular in recent years, is that of nature therapy. Sometimes referred to as ecotherapy, sort of describing a broad range of techniques and treatments with the intention of improving a person's mental or physical health, specifically with the person's re-immersion into the natural world, into the biosphere, and this sort of global ecological system that integrates all things that live on this planet. And one segment of this space, known as forest bathing, or, and I hope I pronounced this right, Shinrin-Yoku in the Japanese context, describes a practice that combines a range of exercises and tasks in an outdoor environment to increase mental and physical health. Sometimes referred to, there's other terms, garden therapy, horticultural therapy, ocean therapy, all forms of nature therapy. And today we have a really fascinating guest who's at the epicenter of all of this, who's going to take us further along this theme, and that's Amos Clifford. Amos is the founder of the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy Guides and Programs, a project of reconnecting nature immersion with healthcare globally. Amos has a BS in Organizational Development, a Master's in Counseling from the University of San Francisco, and he began his career as a wilderness guide back in 1972, and back then taught his first classes to troubled teens on how to get them back into nature and sort of reconnect with it. He served for many years as a wilderness adventure programs in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and he's currently the founder of Turning Point Youth Services in Tulare County, California, where he's developed and managed these programs that included these pioneering approaches to ecotherapy, specifically reconnecting troubled teens to nature. He's the author of several books, including Your Guide to Forest Bathing, Experiencing the Healing Power of Nature. All that, Amos, thanks so much for offering to come on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So can you just start off? I mean, we would love to give our guests the floor for a while and just tell us more about yourself, your background, where you grew up, how you got interested in social work, and then ultimately how in counseling, and how you got interested in this really fascinating area of nature reimmersion.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, I want to clarify something on my bio. I founded Turning Point Youth Services in 1980, I believe, and it's been quite a few years since I've been in that position. Since then, my career has taken me into some other interesting areas. A lot of that is education consulting, where I'm working with educators in trying to develop wellness programs, connecting connecting students and staff and parents with each other in a sense of community. And I did a lot of that work, and in 2012 I founded the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy Guides and Programs. So I've been full-time with this project since then. And it's been a really phenomenal project. It's grown. We have, I think, about 600 guides now in 44 countries that we've trained. And all of the trainings fill up, and people who take the trainings unanimously report that the training experience itself is a really fabulous and highly valued part of their life experience. So we just finished a training, I think about a week and a half ago, where one of the trainees was Robert Czar, who's a physician, who's the founder of Parks RX America. So there's clearly an overlapping mission there. He's trying to get physicians to prescribe spending time outdoors for the well-being of people. And one of the developments in that is, instead of just prescribing go outdoors for your well-being, go outdoors with some specific intervention, like a guided forest therapy walk that's done skillfully, that will maximize the benefits you get from the limited time that most people will spend outdoors. So, but I know your question, Ira, was how did I get into this? Mm-hmm. And I would say that, you know, for me, my story begins when I was still in the crib, and I had a very formative experience there, where for probably a period of several months, when I woke up in the morning, I could hear the trees outside singing to each other, and I could understand the general sense of what they were singing. I'd like to say I could understand their words, but it was more a sense in my heart. And what they were singing was just about their joy of being who they were. The oranges trees would sing, "Oranges, oranges, we are oranges," and there's so much joy in that. And the lemon trees would answer the same way, "We are lemons," and there was so much joy in that. We don't live in a culture where that kind of sensibility is recognized or reinforced, so unsurprisingly, I forgot how to hear those trees, those voices. So while I might have forgotten how to hear them, how to hear the trees singing, I never forgot that they do sing. Mm-hmm. And so for me, a part of my trajectory was being born with this awareness of the sentience of other than human beings. Mm-hmm. And I think the science is really catching up on this now. There's a lot of studies around how trees are like a grandparent tree will take care of its young ones and how they'll communicate together. And there's many markers of sentience. And by sentience, I don't mean the same thing as human cognitive processes, sure, because they're trees. Right. You know, they're not humans. It's a different thing. That there does seem to be some way in which we can connect with that sentience. So starting way back then, that would have been, 1955, hearing those trees sing. And then growing up in a time with my generation, I think my generation was the last of the generations that just had tons of outdoor, unsupervised free play. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Santa Barbara, where the nature was very beautiful. I lived up in Mission Canyon area, right up in the foothills of the San Ynez Range. And one of the local features in my neighborhood was the Santa Barbara Botanical Gardens, which had no fence or entry fee at the time. That was one of my playgrounds. Mm. And so this kind of connection with nature is a natural thing for me, right? So for many people, it seems extraordinary, but the gap between it being an extraordinary experience and remembering how ordinary it is a small gap. We have it in our DNA and in our bones to remember our fundamental relationship with the more than human world. And so the project of that I'm doing now, training guides, a lot of what guides do, they'll take you on a 3-hour walk. You'll go maybe a quarter mile, a half mile, and that gap will close for you. Mm-hmm. You'll remember, you'll have a very direct, heartfelt, visceral experience. Although I grew up in a very fortunate setting, my family setting was not as fortunate. And by the time I was 14 or so, I was essentially, no parents, basically abandoned, and I ended up incarcerated for a year. And at the end of that period of incarceration, this group of people came by and said, "Hey, we take kids like you up into the mountains for 21 days, to really help you find your strengths. And would you like to come along?" And they had a trip leaving 2 days after my release date. So I said, "Sign me up." One of the really beautiful experiences in my life was that the director of the boys' camp where I was incarcerated gave me a parting gift of a pair of hiking boots. He said, "Here's your boots for your journey, and may it be well, and may I never see you here again." And I feel like that was a huge gift for me in some ways. Spiritually, I'm still wearing those same boots. You know, I'm on that journey. And I did very well in that wilderness trip. You know, it was one of these 21-day kind of based on the outward bound model.
Mm-hmm.
And the staff there invited me back to be an assistant. So I came back the next season as an assistant, was assigned to assist the climbing instructor, and that launched several decades of me doing wilderness guiding, which is mostly a seasonal job. You know, it peaks throughout the summer, and then there's a period in the winter where leading winter backcountry trips was a part of what I did. But in the meantime, I worked as a counselor, and without any particular training, I was hired to work as a counselor in this 21-bed residential treatment facility for adult opiate addicts, many of whom we would say now are dual diagnosis. They had significant mental health problems, and most of them had fairly significant criminal histories, and many of them had been in and out of jail for longer than I'd been alive. And so I was kind of, you know, thrown into the deep end. And from that, I really went into this deep inquiry of what does it mean to help people? What are the skills that I need to have? What are the understandings I need to have? And that started, you know, an inquiry that I would say continues to this day. But after 3 years there, I founded Turning Point Youth Services. I got a very small grant, $38,000. I really wanted to work more on the preventive end of the spectrum instead of with, you know, the ones who had been decades down the road, though that's important work too. I just felt more called to the younger people. And over the next 13 years there, I grew that to a very large agency that had a multi-million-dollar budget and worked in a number of clinics. Then I felt done with that, you know. However, I tended to hire, when I was there, I tended to hire professionals like licensed therapists who also had wilderness experience. So this is not unusual for people who are guides to be in the helping professions like social work or psychotherapy or something. And so they would come and I would hire them. And our programs continually emphasized, if we're working with young people and we're working with family therapy in the clinical setting, what can we do to reinforce and supplement that by taking them into the wilderness setting? And so I don't know if the term ecotherapy had been invented yet. It might have been. I think Theodore Roszak was writing back then, but I certainly wasn't aware of his work. We tend to call it experiential education. Mm-hmm. And our main resources for that were like Kurt Hahn from Outward Bound. And so that was very rewarding. I left that position because I got very interested in working directly with schools. I formed another, basically a consulting company where I did a lot of work with schools on thinking about if we have these problems in the schools that manifest as misbehaving or troublesome students and self-destructive behavior, can we look at that as we would as a therapist as a systemic issue? And what can we do about systemic interventions where essentially we're rebuilding the culture instead of scapegoating the kids, you know? And this is very much rooted in the family therapy approaches that I had learned in my training as a therapist, which I did, by the way. I didn't do my college education until I was in my 30s. By the time I started going to college, I had licensed clinical social workers, licensed clinical psychologists, MFTs. I had a full staff of those. I had been working with them for quite a long time as a counselor with them. And so I finally decided I probably ought to go to school. And so I did that and did an undergrad and graduate school degree and then taught at University of San Francisco. In their graduate school, I taught family therapy of substance abuse for a while and a couple of other courses. But college professor isn't really a good fit for my personality. And so then I went on and I worked with schools to develop these programs. And I kept encountering over and over again these kind of fundamental barriers, which is that the organizational inertia is very, very, very strong. And as I was working for these schools, the first of the standardized tests started coming in, and my heart just sank when I saw that, and it still does. I'm very very distressed by what has happened to schools with the emphasis on achievement as measured by standardized tests.
Right.
And part of that is that to me it seems very clearly more about social conditioning and control than it does about education, about drawing out the inner person, helping each person find their unique set of gifts and contributions to the society. And instead, I mean, nowadays we have a thing called the STEM curriculum. If you know, science, technology, engineering, and math. If that's who you are, great, education's set up for you. But if that's not who you are, you gotta find another way.
Right.
And it's even a misnomer to call it education. It's actually schooling. It's a different thing. Those are two different concepts. So I did that, worked with that for quite a while. And then I took a job with the restorative justice field. So restorative justice is an alternative to retributive justice. It's where when there's been a crime, you bring the offender and the victim together. If you've done, after a lot of preparation and assessing to make sure it's the right process for them, to come into a dialogue where an understanding emerges of what happened, who was affected and how, what harms there were, what obligations come into being as a result of those harms, and what can be done to make things right, or as right as possible. So I worked with that for quite a while and did a lot of studying about restorative justice. You know, in the restorative justice field in our country, there's this idea that we've learned it from indigenous cultures. And I got very curious about that. And I started looking into restorative justice in indigenous cultures. And all cultures have some form of justice. Mm-hmm. It's not always restorative. But what I saw where there were restorative frameworks in indigenous cultures mm-hmm. is that those frameworks were an expression of a culture that was intact, and a part of being an intact culture is there's linked to the land. There's not a sense of we are separate from the land and its beings. There's a sense that as humans, we are a species among many species, right. And that, you know, in the Lakota phrase, all my relations applies rather than all those natural resources, which is our cultural point of view. You know, we have this cultural point of view. Forests exist as resources primarily for humans to exploit. Right. And this is a very unbalanced point of view. It's has led to a lot of trouble that we're in now. So as I got interested in that, I went to my board of directors and I said, you know, I'd like to develop a form of restorative justice that involves, just as we have dialogues between victims and offenders, it involves dialogues between us humans and other than human beings. Remember back to when I was hearing the trees, right? That fundamental early experience gave me the idea that we could possibly have direct dialogue with other than human beings that of a restorative nature, where we could go to Willow Tree. And we could say, Willow, what do you have to tell us humans now about your experience? And what ask do you have of us? You know, what guidance can we get? And one day this method came over me. And when I say came over me, what I mean is I don't think I thought it up. I think I caught it somehow. It's what we call an earth dreaming in this field. It's like dreams up through the body. This is a method that I started experimenting with. I started taking it into schools for humans, human to human interactions. I'll tell you this about schools. Schools like to do things like adopt anti-bullying programs and hire people like me to go in and teach them how to do anti-bullying programs. But if you're observant at all, what you realize is that the bullying is endemic at all levels, among the teachers, among the administrators, among the parents, and this idea of going in and fixing the students is an evasion of responsibility. Get that? Because the responsibility is with the grown-ups to get their stuff together. And we keep giving up on that and saying, well, let's go fix the kids. I saw this very strongly working with schools in restorative justice. And when I started going back to schools, you know, with this method of dialogue with the more than human world, started using it with the humans. And we had the teachers and administrators all sitting and going through this process of mapping out the relationships with each other, identifying where there were what we call knots, restrictions in the flow of the good energy in the relationship, and leaning into that and going into state of inquiry in that. But we can do the same thing with other than human beings. I kept feeling that this was a good thing, but it was still not the thing for me. So in 2011, I went on a vision fast, and on that fast, the elder guide on that fast really called me out. He said, Amos, it's time for you to step into elderhood. Your people need you as an elder. I don't know what that means. There were no like particular intact cultural elders in my upbringing, but I listened and I accepted that as my intention for the 4-day, 4-night vision fast ceremony. And I went out onto the land and it had some beautiful experiences around holding this question, what does it mean to be an elder? And also, what does it mean to be a guide? Mm-hmm. And it really didn't answer the question completely, but I came away with a couple of things that were very clear. One is being an elder means being of service. That's what it means. A total dedication to service to my people. The other thing that I came away with was that we are in a disaster of human making right now. It's not in the future. It's right now. We don't have time to waste. My service has to be somehow around that. And then another intuition I had was that at the roots of this disaster is that we've forgotten that we are in relationship with all the other beings in the world. We've forgotten that. We've gone into the trance of looking at everything else as insentient resources there primarily for us to exploit. Mm-hmm. I knew I had to do something to remember, right? And it's not a big gap, but there's a lot of people to close that gap with. So over the next year, I did a year-long men's soul initiation journey that was a very, very powerful experience, ended with a 5-day fast also. And then shortly after that, I did a month-long training that included a 4-day vision fast. And on that 4-day vision fast, I got more clarity. So for me, what I see is the first fast, the initiation, and then month-long with that fast is all one story. That was all one period of deep inquiry for me. So now we're in 2012, and this literature on Shinrin-Yoku comes across my desk. And I'm looking at that, and it lights me up for several reasons. One reason is it's a short form. You don't have to be athletic to do it. Mm-hmm. It's accessible for anyone. You don't even have to go to a forest. You can do it in a city park. Mm-hmm. There's science behind it. That means it's marketable, right? That takes it out of the realm of woo, right, into the realm of we can say yes about this without feeling self-conscious about what our friends are going to think about us. Right? Right. Then another thing that really lit me up was that the article that I read was that said that it was integrated into the Japanese healthcare system. Mm-hmm. Turns out there was something lost in translation there. It's not exactly the way we would think of it as being integrated in the healthcare system, but it's there. And the Japanese people are, for the most part, very aware of the practice of Shinrin-Yoku. And, many of them go and practice this. In fact, when I was at Akasawa Healing Forest, the guide there showed me a chart, and he showed how a few years before, 100,000 people had come to that healing forest in Japan. That's a beautiful thing. That's phenomenal. But the thing that really interested me here was the possibility of mobilizing the largest referral network in the country, maybe in the world, the medical referral network, to connect people with nature. So I went down to the Kaiser National Headquarters in Oakland, and I met with some, kind of middle-level managers. Mm-hmm. I showed them a research, and I said, I want to train guides. Would you guys be willing to include this in your programs? They said, well, yeah, we like the research, and we might do that as soon as you have trained guides in every community we serve. So, I left with my, $18 worth of savings and a determination to train 1,000 guides to high standards of skills and knowledge, high enough that they would inspire the confidence of physicians to refer to them. And to get that done, I did at the winter solstice of 2012. I had a ceremony with with my community, where I made a formal commitment to give the next 10 years of my life to bringing this into being. And so after that, I spent a couple of years working with my mentees and some colleagues and guiding many, many walks and experimenting until we found a specific pattern. We call it now the standard sequence. In my book, it's called the optimal flow, but when we train guides, we call it the standard sequence, that when people follow this, they reliably have an experience that they value, that's good for them. And so in September 2014, we trained our first cohort of guides. I'm leaving tomorrow to go to the training for the 36th cohort of guides.
Wow.
And we have, I think, 20 guide trainings scheduled this year, and they all fill up with very little advertising, which tells me this, that the earth is telling a lot of people it's time, that this is what's needed, and people are responding to that. So when people come to these trainings, what they're getting is they're getting this synthesis. If you think of all the different strands of my life and you weave those together, along with some other things I've learned. So you take the strand of wilderness guiding, you take the strand of psychotherapy. I didn't mention this, 25 years of Zen practice. I'm also the founder of Sky Creek Dharma Center in Chico, California. You take the educational consulting, community building, restorative justice, vision fast. You weave all these strands together into one rope. That rope is the practice that's now being known globally as North American style forest therapy.
It's a fascinating story, and it's amazing. It's an amazing path. But I'm so amazed that you made it all happen, and it's coming to fruition in this context. Especially when you mention organization like Kaiser, and which is a major provider of healthcare in the United States. That
I'll tell you something about Kaiser. Yeah, interesting thing about Kaiser, like I don't know how to get the medical system to adopt this, but about 4 or 5 cohorts ago, we had a physician train who was a CEO at Kaiser.
There you go.
That's how it's happening. We're getting more physicians training. Every physician that trains with us, everyone so far comes away saying, this is phenomenal. I'm all in. What can I do to promote this?
Yeah. And it makes sense because, look, we're spending what now, $3 trillion a year on stuff that unfortunately isn't doing a lot. And if something like this is the bridge to sort of some of the answers we've been looking for the last 100 years of healthcare in this country, then you found something. You really, and you have the CEO there. That's amazing. It's very fascinating listening to your journey and some of the things you're mentioning. A couple of weeks ago, I did a show with the gentleman that was involved in the sort of the human-animal interaction, and there were some very similar themes in the sense of sort of the reconnection. Well, at that level, you're talking more of sort of the entire biosphere, while he was specifically focusing on animals. But some of the themes were very fascinating, and I posed this question then, and I sort of want to pose it to you because you have a much broader context. What, in your opinion, this is a philosophical question, but what, in your opinion, has caused us, as the one, we're one of whatever the 9 million species on this planet, when you take into all the bacteria and all the plants and everything, why are we the one species that has strayed so badly from what every other species on this planet seems to know? That, we don't mess with sky, we don't mess up the water, we don't mess up the land. These are bad things. And we shouldn't cut ourselves off from 9 million other sentient creatures that occupy the place with us. And it just seems that somewhere in the last, whatever it is, couple hundred years, we went astray. Why is this?
Well, it's a beautiful question. I think it's a bit above my pay grade. There's a beautiful one that's called Plants as Persons of Philosophical Botany. And that writer very specifically looks at the long history when we went from experiencing plants as having soul and having agency to experiencing them as just crops to use, and I'm afraid that I can't articulate in a brief way how that happened. I'll tell you this, when we come into the forest, and and we are coming in a way that's humble and vulnerable. And we're listening, not so much from our heads, but from our hearts. So this is a very important thing for forest therapy, is understanding that we have at least two big intelligences. And one is our head intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one that our culture values, reinforces, trains.
Right.
We have a heart intelligence. That's the one that in our culture is essentially invisible. Like, I don't know, how many classes did you take in school that had anything to do with educating your heart and your and helping you to tune into what is your body saying right now.
Right.
If you have a question, what does your heart say? What
Right.
does tenderness mean? What does it mean to act to get received from tenderness?
Right.
When we go in to a forest or any natural place, forests are very, very alive with this, with our hearts awake. What they seem to be saying is this: welcome back. You humans are really important on the landscape. You humans belong here, and we need you here. But we need you to remember how to be here.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome home.
That's...
So I know that doesn't address your question.
No.
How
Actually,
did we stray?
It actually does. it actually is quite elegant, and the ability to understand this and view, let's say, the sort of the beauty that's out there in this thing that's living, this living biosphere that we're part of. I think it perfectly addresses it, and I appreciate that. Before we get into some of sort of the what we'll say the clinical opportunities, sort of, the different conditions and so forth, do you see in today's, a couple months ago I bought this book on nature deprivation syndromes, and dealt with everything that the children nowadays in this generation are missing because they're so stuck to their little devices. Are you seeing much more the children in this generation being cut off, let's say, than in previous? I mean, I grew up here in Philadelphia, sort of an urban jungle, but nonetheless, I was able to, as you get out in parks, the mountains are only about an 85-minute drive from here. The beach is about 65 minutes. So we were able to tap into things, but now it seems, even though the stuff's there, we are somehow, the tentacles of the information system are just keeping our children hypnotized in the context that they don't even know what nature is anymore. I mean, we fortunately take our kids out and we immerse them in all things green and blue. Are you seeing more of a problem nowadays with the children versus adults, or is it kind of equal?
I was just spoke at an environmental justice conference in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago, and one of the presenters there said that kids nowadays spend 3 to 7 minutes on average in unstructured outdoor time, and on average 6 to 7 hours of screen time per day, right? And that to me sounds like a problem. And I think that there's hardly anyone that would argue with the notion that that's alarming. Also, we're having now, in our guide trainings, we're having quite a few millennials come through. And it's very interesting what they tell us. They tell us that millennials really have a disconnection, a desire to connect, but don't know how to. And so they're looking for these kinds of opportunities. Now, remember the thing I told you about my idea about how, when we're, for example, we're trying to do anti-bullying programs with kids, when we really need to do it with the adult community and let it filter out.
Right.
I feel like it's the same with Nature Connect. And get kids outdoors. I tell you what, get the grandparents outdoors, get the parents outdoors, and the kids will come. Right? Let's get families outdoors. We've recently started exploring partnership with some agencies that really specialize in Latino, Hispanic, environmental activism. And one of the things that we're learning with them is that getting the whole family outdoors together is very, very powerful, much more so than splitting them up, right?
Makes
and
sense.
so I would say that's much more biased. I am very concerned that we're doing the same thing with nature that we did with, say, drug abuse. All the grown-ups are getting high, but let's make the kids stop. Bullying, I mean, look at the bullying from the very top in our culture, but let's make the kids stop, right? Get outside in nature. The adults aren't structuring their lives to spend quality time out where they need to, so let's make the kids do it.
Right.
No, we got to do this together. This is a multi-generational task, and we need each other. This is one of the things about nature connection. We need other human beings to do this. So we need to go out with our groups of friends. We need to go out with our families.
Excellent.
Spend the time doing this. If you go out with a guide will know, a guide that we've trained, a guide will know how to really help you do that.
So moving forward then, so can you tell us a little bit about the different, what we'll say, indications or the sort of most promising, I don't want to say diseases, but conditions that you see this helping in? Obviously, it's a broad swath. There's a variety, no doubt, psychological issues that this is going to be very useful for. I'm thinking, in things of lowering blood pressure and stress levels, which obviously have a major trickle down to all sorts of biologic stuff happening in our bodies. Just give us a sort of a broad spectrum of all the different things that you see, and maybe some of the clinicians that you take out there that might start suggesting. I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, sure. I want to just put it into maybe two or possibly three categories, but the two that come to mind is the physical health benefits that have been very well studied and documented, particularly by Japanese and Korean researchers.
Okay.
So one of those is when we go outside and we're in a forest, and some kinds of forests, particularly coniferous forests, are exhaling these compounds called phytoncides. Mm-hmm. And when we breathe those, they have beneficial effects on our bodies. One of the measurable beneficial effects is there's an increase in the natural killer cell count. Okay. So this is an indicator of immune functioning. Mm-hmm. When our immune systems are suppressed by the daily stresses of urban life, a good indicator that is the NK, natural killer cell count, is relatively low. Mm-hmm. You go on one guided forest therapy walk, the Japanese have established this, there will be a significant increase, and that will persist for a week to a month, depending on how long your walk was. This is a very good thing. These NK cells are the ones that are patrolling around finding like a cancerous cell and destroying. Right. And when they're suppressed, we're not as well. There are many other similar benefits that are indicators of improved stress response. So our bodies get reset from stress. Our nervous systems recover from stress. Our immune system is boosted. Some of the markers of what would I call it, like things that accelerate aging, they decrease. And so most of what I'm telling you right now are things that I've heard from physicians. And again, some of it's a little bit beyond my pay grade. Very good books on this. My colleagues in Japan, Dr. Lee, Dr. Miyazaki, have written great books on this that really go into the science. My book touches on it a little bit, on my understanding of the basic things. So the physical health benefits are really strong. Now we know that the physical and the mental are all one system. Okay. And the idea that, mental health is different than physical health is kind of this strange artifact of a past idea. But when our bodies are not functioning well, we're much more vulnerable to mental health issues, and vice versa. When our mental health is not good, we're much more vulnerable to becoming physically sick. So it's one system. And so I would call this idea of how forest therapy works a kind of a pharmaceutical idea. You go into the forest, you get a dose, and you have specific beneficial changes in your body. So that's one box. Now, the way that we do it is based on a different set of assumptions. It's sort of yes and. We say, yes, that's very important. But we're looking, for me personally, I'm coming much more from a depth psychology. So this would be the psychology of Carl Jung and his followers. Most eco-psychology and ecotherapy based on this work. And the depth psychology point of view is that in our ordinary culture, our journey towards full-on authenticity, towards becoming ourselves, is challenged by the pressures of the society around us. The church tells us we should be one way, our parents tell us, our employers tell us, advertising tells us. whatever news channel we watch, now social media, constantly shaping this kind of sense of who we should be. And in some ways, that's very, very important because that the general consensus allows us to operate together as a society. On the other hand, it's very problematic because we lose our sense of our authentic selves and what we were born to bring into the world, the fullness of who we are, our particular medicine to bring to the people gets suppressed. The world suffers when that happens. When all of us together are losing touch with our medicine and not bringing it to heal ourselves, our people, and the more than human world, the world suffers. This is what we're seeing right now. So we're seeing a world that's suffering deeply because we humans are not bringing forward our medicine. So in the Jungian, the depth psychology point of view, what happens is you create processes that support people bringing up from the depths an encounter with their authentic self and beginning to manifest that, to embody that. So this is what Carl Jung called the individuation process. This is very classic and has been studied by people who study, for example, rites of passage, vision quests. The way we train our guides, our main theory is actually based on a 3-hour, what's called a liminal journey, where you depart from your experience of the ordinary world, and you go on a 3-hour journey, and then you return to the ordinary world. And that journey between those two thresholds, we call the first threshold of departing, we call that the threshold of connection, connecting back with yourself, with the more than human world, to the connection to the second threshold, which is the threshold of incorporation. You're incorporating what you've taken, and now you're going back into the ordinary world. In between, people have extraordinary experiences. And that threshold of connection, what our guides are trained, kind of simple. It's noticing where you are, noticing your body, and giving your full attention to your senses and your sensual reactions to this experience. In other words, your enjoyment of. So in other words, getting kind of out of the head, coming into the heart. This is the threshold. We're taking you into your heart intelligence. When you're there, we give a series of invitations. So we don't give exercises, we don't give tasks, we orient everyone. Everything we're doing, we're suggesting. It's an invitation. Try this out. And through those invitations, people have encounters with the forest, but any encounter we're having outside of ourselves is in some way a mirror of who we are. Like if you and I look at a stone, we'll see that stone 2 different ways. That's because we're 2 different people. It's an encounter. We're each having an encounter with ourselves. Right? If you follow that. In our training, we don't train therapists, even though it's called forest therapy. We train guides because this is the way of the guide. The way of the guide is to open the doors of the heart and then to get out of the way. Because if any therapy happens, it's between the forest and the person.
Sure. Makes perfect sense.
So we say the forest is the therapist. The guide opens the doors. And a key part of that, and this is in the guide archetype, is that we very specifically avoid having any idea or imposing any idea on people of what they should encounter on their walk. So there's studies, for example, there's a study that says, if you go into the forest, you'll experience awe, right? Well, maybe, but that's not my business as a guide. That's your business and the business of your relationship with the forest. Because you might encounter grief, you might encounter sorrow, you might encounter great joy, you might have a unity experience, you might be bored. You'll get what is right for you. And this is in the framework of guiding. And then we bring people together frequently along the journey, and we just ask each person to share in the group, what are you noticing right now? What are you noticing? By doing that, each person can share whatever their experience is in a context where it will be witnessed and accepted. Because I tell you, they can go back to the office, they can go back to the dinner table, they can try to explain what just happened. People aren't going to get it. They're just not going to relate. So it's very important that they get that feedback. This is what I say. One of the things we say is culture repair and nature connection arise together. Just for a minute, we create an intact culture that has this feature. You can share your experience with without anyone judging it, trying to change it, criticizing it, anything. We're just accepting it and letting it come. That helps get it into the bones. The third category is much more macro. So the much more macro category is this one of these large-scale studies that show when there's deforestation happening in a region, like say in the Pacific Northwest, clear cutting, loss to disease, wildfire, the human mortality rates even at a distance from those forests goes, there's a decline in human public health in general, and the correlations are inarguable. So that's kind of a more macro level. So part of what I'm hoping will happen for people when they do these walks is they will develop a strong connection from their heart to the more than human world, and they will become advocates, and they'll become aware, and they'll know that forests are much more than crops.
Yep.
You know, that I'm not against, by the way, I'm not against intelligent forestry, but I see very little of it.
Agreed.
I get that lumber doesn't grow on the racks down at the hardware store. I get that we have to harvest trees. But the question is, how can we do this with tenderness toward our relations, the trees? How can we do this in a way that honors the intrinsic interbeing of all species? I think it's possible. And this is what we're faced with, remembering as a species now, is how to do that.
Such a wonderful thing. And yeah, it makes complete sense that, hey, you start messing around with organisms, integrated system. It's been around for a couple billion years. It's gonna slingshot back the wrong way at you. And that's, yeah, I mean, it's wonderful what you're doing and how you've organized this and your thinking. I think people watching the show are going to extremely much, appreciate it. As we get near the end to wrapping up, we want to sort of move. We typically move away from sort of the theme we're talking about, and we just pose a more of a fantasy science fiction question to our guest, which typically has to do with if I was to give to you, Amos Clifford, a time machine for you to travel anywhere to meet somebody that you've always wanted to talk to and have a conversation, who would that person be? And what would you, Amos, want to talk to them about? You can go to the past or the future as far as you want, but only one person you need to choose.
Well, I guess I'd want to meet my father, who died when I was 5. I think I'd want to travel back and spend some time with my father, understand who he was, maybe what he might have had to teach me. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. There are many people in history who I am very, very touched by. And I might, for example, want to spend some time with Mary Magdalene. I might want to spend some time with the Buddha, Jesus. But I appreciate the question. It's interesting to me that what really comes over me in my heart is what would it be like to have known my father?
That's a beautiful answer, and nothing wrong with that. I take that one to heart myself, because I lost my father at a young age too. So I definitely appreciate that. Amos, I mean, it was wonderful. I really appreciate you spending your time today, sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, your history, and I just found it a fascinating story that I think lots of people are going to be very interested in. For anyone, once again, Amos Clifford, founder of the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy Guides and Programs, is a wonderful book, Your Guide to Forest Bathing, Experiencing the Healing Power of Nature, really doing some tremendous things at the macro level to affect nature and ultimately the trickle down to human beings. And just thank you for everything you're doing, and thank you for so much for spending time on the show with us today. It's a great thing, and the people like you are out there doing this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ira. It's really a pleasure to be on your show. I love being asked these questions, and I hope that they touch a few of your listeners in their hearts in a good way. So I appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again.